She was on her knees in the freezing rain, 3 months pregnant, barefoot, holding nothing but a torn bag against her chest as she begged the only family she had left not to throw her unborn child into the darkness. Her mother-in-law laughed, the servants looked away, and the man who had promised to protect her didn't say a word. He simply looked into her tear-filled eyes, turned around, and closed the front door himself. That sound didn't just lock her outside, it buried the woman she used to be. 18 months later, the same family gathered behind that very door again. Only this time, they weren't waiting to throw her out. They were praying she would walk back in. When the doors finally opened, every face in the room turned white. No one spoke, no one breathed, because the woman standing there with a beautiful little child, holding her hand, looked nothing like the broken girl they had laughed at that rainy night. They thought they had destroyed her. They had no idea they had created the one person who now held the power to destroy everything they loved. And what happened after that didn't just change their lives, it became the kind of karma no amount of money could ever erase. Stay with me until the very end, because the last words she speaks before walking away forever aren't shouted, they're whispered, and those whispers become the punishment her in-laws carry for the rest of their lives. Welcome back to Mr. James Family Returns. Thank you for spending a little of your day with me. Settle in, because today's story will take you on an unforgettable journey of heartbreak, hope, and the kind of karma that changes everything. Let's begin. Rain doesn't fall in Boston in October. It attacks. Nia Carter Sterling was on her knees on the marble steps of the Sterling mansion, one hand pressed flat against her stomach, the other clutching a torn canvas bag that held everything she now owned in the world. 3 months pregnant, barefoot. The cold had stopped being cold an hour ago. Now it was just a fact, like gravity, like the door in front of her. Ethan. Her voice cracked on his name. Please, look at me. He didn't. He stood in the doorway in a charcoal suit that cost more than her father had earned in a year, and his jaw was tight, and his eyes were somewhere over her shoulder, fixed on the driveway, the gate, anywhere that wasn't her face. Behind him, in the warm gold light of the foyer, Margaret Sterling adjusted an earring and did not bother to lower her voice. Close it, Ethan. 18 months later, a boardroom on the 41st floor of a glass tower in Chicago. 19 people in the room, and every single one of them was standing. A woman walked in wearing a black suit so simply cut it could only have been expensive, a diamond ring catching the light on her left hand, and beside her, holding her hand, small fingers wrapped around 2 of hers, a boy not yet 2 years old, with a face that made 3 grown adults at that table go pale before she'd said a single word. No one in that room breathed. Then the memory snapped shut, and we are back in the rain 18 months earlier, because that is where this story actually begins. Not with the ending, but with the door. Nia hadn't always known this house as a prison. There had been a version of her, younger, hopeful, foolish maybe, who had walked through these same doors 9 months earlier, believing that a marriage, even one built on obligation instead of love, could still become something real if she just gave it enough of herself. She'd been wrong, but she hadn't known that yet on her wedding day. Her father, Samuel Carter, had cried at that wedding, not from joy exactly, but from something heavier. 31 years he'd worked for Richard Sterling. 31 years of early mornings, of quietly steering the old man away from disastrous deals, of loyalty nobody outside that office had ever seen or thanked him for. When Richard sat him down 8 months before the wedding and said, "Samuel, I want your daughter to marry my son," Samuel hadn't understood it as an honor. He'd understood it as a debt being called in, one he never knew he'd been owed. "Are you sure, Nia?" He'd asked her the night before the wedding, sitting in her cramped one-bedroom apartment, the only home she'd ever known. "You don't have to do this because of me." "I'm not doing it because of you, Baba." She'd taken his weathered hand. "I'm doing it because Mr. Sterling asked, and because you spent your whole life trusting that man. I trust him too." She hadn't yet met the son that should have told her something. The marriage that followed was not cruel in the way people expect cruelty to look. There were no raised hands, no shouted threats. Ethan Sterling's cruelty was quieter than that, and somehow worse. It was the cruelty of a man who had decided, before he'd even shaken her hand, that she didn't deserve his attention, At their engagement dinner, when a business partner asked how the two of them met, Ethan had answered without looking up from his plate, "My father arranged it. She's the daughter of his secretary." A pause. Then, almost as an afterthought, as if delivering a punchline, "The charity case my father forced into this family." The table had laughed. Nia had smiled. "Because that was what you did. Because Richard Sterling was sitting 3 seats away. And she would not embarrass her father's employer, would not embarrass her own father, would not give Margaret Sterling the satisfaction of watching her flinch." But something in her chest had folded that night and never quite opened back up. Margaret made sure it never did. She corrected Nia's posture at dinner as though training a dog. She introduced her to guests as Ethan's arrangement, and let the word sit there ugly and precise. Once, when Nia offered to help set the table for a dinner party, Margaret had actually laughed, a short, sharp sound, and said, "Darling, we have staff for that. You're not staff, you're just temporary." The servants, at least, were kind to her. Rosa, who'd worked in the Sterling kitchen for 11 years, would slip her an extra plate of food when Margaret ordered the smallest portions for Ethan's wife's figure. Once, Rosa had squeezed her hand and whispered, "You're stronger than they know, Mrs. Sterling." And Nia had had to excuse herself to the bathroom to cry without anyone seeing. She never told her father any of it. Samuel Carter had given his whole life to this family's dignity. She would not be the reason he lost faith in the one good thing he believed he'd built. Richard Sterling was the only person in that house who ever looked at her like she mattered. He was dying by then, though only a handful of people knew it. A cancer that had started in his lungs and was quietly, methodically finishing what it started. He'd lost weight. His hands shook when he held his coffee cup. But his eyes, when they found Nia across a room, still held something warm. "You remind me of your father," he told her once, in the quiet of his study, the only room in the house that felt like it belonged to someone with a soul. "Samuel never once, in 31 years, told me what I wanted to hear instead of what I needed to hear. That's rarer than gold, Nia, rarer than this whole empire. Why did you really want us to marry, Mr. Sterling?" She'd finally asked him, 3 weeks before he died, when she was newly pregnant and hadn't told anyone yet, not even Ethan. "Ethan doesn't want me here." Richard had been quiet for a long moment, turning his wedding ring on his finger. "Because I made your father a promise a very long time ago," he said. "A promise I intend to keep one way or another, even after I'm gone. You'll understand what I mean, not now, but you will." She hadn't understood. She'd assumed he meant something sentimental, a wish for family, for connection. She would not learn what he actually meant for a very long time, and when she finally did, it would break something open in her chest all over again, in an entirely different direction. 3 weeks later, Richard Sterling was dead. The funeral was enormous. Senators, CEOs, a governor. Margaret wore black Chanel and accepted condolences like compliments. Ethan stood at the pulpit and gave a eulogy about legacy and vision that never once mentioned kindness, because Nia suspected he didn't know his father had had any left over for him specifically, only for her. She stood at the back of the church, 3 months along, alone, and nobody offered her a seat near the family. The house went silent after the funeral. Grief, Nia told herself. Give them time. 3 days later, Margaret Sterling smiled at breakfast for the first time in a year. Nia should have known what that smile meant. She didn't, not yet. She was too busy feeling the first flutter of movement low in her stomach, too busy allowing herself for one dangerous moment to hope that grief might soften this family instead of hardening it further. That night there was a knock at her bedroom door. Not Ethan's knock. She'd learned the difference months ago. The particular silence that always preceded his entrances, how he never actually knocked at all, just walked in like the room belonged to him because everything in this house did. This was Margaret. "Pack a bag," Margaret said, without preamble, without even the courtesy of malice in her voice, just flat, administrative cruelty, the tone of a woman closing a file. "Tonight." "What? You heard me. Richard is gone. The promise he made your father died with him. There is no reason for you to remain in this family, and I will not spend one more day pretending there is. I'm pregnant, Margaret. I'm carrying Ethan's child." Something flickered across the older woman's face. Calculation, maybe, or the ghost of a conscience quickly suppressed. "That," she said, "is a problem for lawyers, not for tonight." Nia found Ethan in his father's old study 40 minutes later, the only bag she owned packed with what little was truly hers. He was sitting behind the desk that used to be Richard's, staring at nothing. "Ethan, your mother is throwing me out. Say something. Please." He looked at her then, really looked for the first time in months, and for one suspended second she thought she saw something behind his eyes. Regret, maybe. Or fear. Something human, then it closed like a shutter dropping. "It's better this way," he said quietly. "For both of us." The rain had started an hour before she reached the front steps, the bag already soaked through, her hair plastered to her face. She turned once at the bottom of the stairs and looked back up at him, one last time, some small foolish part of her still hoping. "Ethan, please, not for me, for your child." He said nothing. He turned around, and he closed the door himself. The sound of it, that single final click of the latch, was the loudest thing Nia Carter Sterling had ever heard in her life. Louder than the rain. Louder than her own heartbeat, which she could feel now in her throat, in her ears, in the place low in her belly where something impossibly small was depending on her to survive a night. She had no idea how she was going to survive. She sank to her knees on the wet marble. Somewhere behind that door, warm light glowed through curtained windows. Somewhere behind that door, a family was choosing together to let her disappear. She had no money, no phone that worked. Margaret had made sure of that weeks ago, cancelling the account without telling her, one more small humiliation stacked on the pile. No family in this city. Her father was 3 states away, and calling him meant telling him the truth, and telling him the truth meant destroying the one thing he'd spent his whole life protecting, his belief that loyalty was ever repaid. She stood finally, because staying on her knees in the rain would kill her faster than walking would. She had no idea, as she took her first steps down that long, dark driveway, that a homeless man 3 blocks away, a man the neighborhood mostly ignored, a man who slept behind the old church on Ashford Street with a single duffel bag and a folded American flag he never explained to anyone, was about to become the only reason she and her son survived the next 18 months. She had no idea that this man had once built and sold a business worth more than the entire Sterling Empire, and had walked away from every dollar of it. She had no idea that somewhere in a locked drawer in Richard Sterling's study, there was a letter with her name on it, a letter Richard had left explicit instructions not to be opened for exactly 18 months. She only knew the rain and the cold and the sound of a door closing behind her like a verdict. She started walking. She didn't get far before her body made the decision for her. A sharp pain low in her abdomen, a wave of dizziness, the wet pavement rushing up faster than she could catch herself. The last thing she saw before the world went dark was a pair of worn combat boots stopping in front of her, and a rough voice, urgent and low, saying words she wouldn't remember clearly until much later. "Hey, stay with me, I've got you." The boardroom doors were still open. Nobody had moved. Margaret Sterling's hand had found the back of a chair, gripping it the way a person grips something when the floor has stopped feeling solid. The child at Nia's side tilted his head up at the enormous glass windows, unbothered, humming something to himself. Ethan's eyes were fixed on the boy's face, that face unmistakably, impossibly his own at that age, a photograph come alive. "Nia," he said, just her name. It came out broken in the middle. She didn't answer him yet. That moment would come. This story isn't there yet, either. Because to understand what walked into that room, you have to understand what almost didn't survive at all. She woke to the smell of candle wax and old wood, and for a moment she thought she'd died, and this was whatever came after. "You're awake." The voice was rough, low, unhurried. "Good. Baby's got a strong heartbeat. Scared me for a minute there." Nia's eyes focused slowly. A small room, a converted storage space behind a church she'd learn later, with a cot, a space heater, a folding table stacked with cans of soup. An old man sat across from her on an overturned crate, forearms resting on his knees, watching her with an attention that felt entirely unlike the way anyone in the Sterling house had ever looked at her. He was maybe 70, silver stubble, a face carved by weather and years. His jacket was army surplus, patched at the elbow. His eyes were the kind that had seen things and decided afterward to be gentle anyway.
Where her voice came out as a rasp.
"Church shelter on Ashford. Sister Agnes lets me use this room in exchange for fixing what breaks. You collapsed 2 blocks from here. I carried you in, and Agnes has a niece who's a nurse. She checked you and the baby both. You're dehydrated, exhausted, and about 3 months along. Unless I'm reading that wrong. Why did you help me?" The old man considered the question like it deserved real thought. "Because nobody helped me once. Took me 11 years to forgive people who didn't help me. Figured somewhere along the way I'd rather be the kind of man who does the helping." He extended a scarred hand. Walter Hayes. Nia. She hesitated on the last name, feeling it curdle in her mouth. Just Nia. Something crossed his face. Not pity, which she'd had enough of to last several lifetimes, but recognition, like he understood exactly what it meant for a woman to drop a name mid-sentence. "Well, Nia," he said, and something about the way he said it, plain, unadorned, without judgment or agenda, undid something in her chest that had been wound tight for 9 months. "You're safe here. Nobody's going to hurt you in this room. That's the only promise I can make you, but I intend to keep it." For the first time since her wedding day, someone had called her by a name that wasn't attached to whose wife she was, whose charity case, whose arrangement. She put her face in her hands and cried until there was nothing left, and Walter Hayes sat with her in silence, not fixing it, not rushing her, just present, the way her father used to be. Before all of this, she stayed at the shelter for 6 weeks. Sister Agnes fed her. Walter fixed a leaking pipe, a broken window latch, a door that had stuck for a decade, and every evening he sat across from Nia at the folding table and asked her questions nobody had bothered asking in months. "What did you study before all this?" "Business administration. I never finished. Money ran out senior year." "What would you do if money wasn't the thing stopping you?" She'd laughed, the first real laugh in a long time. "Build something, I don't know. Something that actually helps people instead of just moving money around rich men's accounts." Walter had gone quiet at that, turning his coffee cup slowly in his hands, and something in his expression made her ask carefully, "What did you do, Walter, before the shelter?" "I built things too, once." He didn't elaborate and she didn't push. She'd learn later exactly how much he wasn't saying, that the duffel bag he never let out of his sight held not spare clothes but a folder of old documents, a faded photograph of a woman and a little girl, and a name that used to appear on the cover of business magazines. But that revelation was still months away. What she noticed in those 6 weeks was simpler. Walter never once asked about the baby's father, never asked what she'd run from. He let her keep her silence intact, the way a person handles something fragile without demanding to know how it got cracked. It was Sister Agnes who eventually told her gently, over dishwater one evening, "That man doesn't talk about himself, but I'll tell you this. The diocese got an anonymous donation 11 years back that rebuilt half this shelter, cash, no name attached. I have my suspicions about where it came from." Nia had looked across the room at Walter, hunched over a broken radio, humming something under his breath, and felt the first thread of curiosity pull tight in her chest. The baby came in March, 6 weeks premature but fighting, in a hospital Walter paid for in cash he claimed came from an old savings account. His hands shaking slightly as he held the newborn for the first time. Something moving behind his eyes that Nia couldn't name yet, she decided, looking at her son's small, furious face. "Noah Carter, not Sterling, never Sterling." Walter held the baby like he was afraid he'd break, and afraid too of something else entirely, some old grief surfacing that Nia wouldn't understand until much later, when she learned about the daughter he'd lost, the wife who'd left when the money became more important than the marriage, the empire he'd built and then walked away from because winning had cost him the only things that had ever mattered. "You're going to raise this boy right," Walter said quietly, handing Noah back to her. "Better than anybody raised me to be for a long stretch of years I'm not proud of. I don't know how to do any of this, Walter. I have no money, no family here, no—" "You have a mind sharper than half the executives I ever hired," Walter interrupted, and something in his voice had shifted. Steadier now, more deliberate, like a decision had been made. "And you have time if you're willing to use it instead of wasting it feeling sorry for a family that didn't deserve you in the first place." "Use it how?" Walter looked at her for a long moment, and then he did something he hadn't done in 11 years. He opened the duffel bag, pulled out the worn folder and set it on the table between them. "I built a logistics company from nothing when I was 28, he said. Sold it for $4 billion when I was 51. Lost everything else that mattered while I was doing it. I've spent the last 11 years trying to figure out what I was supposed to do with what was left of me. He tapped the folder. I think I just figured it out. Nia stared at the documents. Contracts, patents, old financial statements bearing a name she vaguely recognized from a business class years ago. "You're going to teach me," she said slowly, understanding dawning. "I'm going to teach you everything I know," Walter said. "And you're going to build something better than I ever did because you'll build it for the right reasons." He paused. "But Nia, this has to stay quiet. Completely quiet. No one can know where you are, or what we're building, or that name you dropped when I asked. You understand why?" She thought of Ethan's back turned to her in the doorway, of Margaret's smile at breakfast, of the sound of a door closing. "Yes," she said, "I understand exactly why." What she didn't know, what wouldn't surface until much later, in a locked drawer 3 states away, was that the promise Richard Sterling had made to her father 31 years earlier wasn't only about a marriage, it was about an 18-month window. It was about a letter, sealed, dated, and waiting. And it was about the fact that Richard Sterling had known, somehow, impossibly, before any of this happened, exactly what kind of man his son might become, and exactly what kind of woman would need 18 months and a stranger's help to become who she was always capable of being. For the first 6 months, Nia studied at night after Noah finally slept, Walter's careful handwriting filling margins of business textbooks Sister Agnes borrowed from the library. She failed at her first small venture, a modest supply chain consulting attempt that collapsed within 8 weeks when a client backed out. She cried for one night, and then Walter sat her down and said the words that would carry her through the next year. "Failure's just information, Nia. The only real failure is the one where you don't get back up and ask what it taught you." She got back up by month 9. She and Walter, with Victoria Hayes, Walter's adopted daughter, brought in quietly as CFO, had built the early architecture of something genuinely new, an AI-driven supply chain optimization platform that could predict and prevent the exact kind of catastrophic failures that had crippled companies like the one she'd married into. Victoria, sharp-eyed and skeptical at first, had studied Nia across a cramped office table during their first real strategy meeting and said, "Dad says you have instincts he hasn't seen since he was building his first company. I don't hand out trust easily, but I'm willing to bet on his judgment. Then let's earn it." Nia had said, and Victoria had almost smiled. By month 12, 3 Fortune 500 companies had signed pilot contracts, drawn to a mysterious, camera-shy founder operating under a private holding entity with no public face and no name attached to press releases. Financial journalists began speculating, a nickname stuck half in irony, half in genuine bewilderment at a founder who refused every interview, every gala, every photograph, the ghost CEO. Nobody connected her to the young woman who disappeared from Boston high society 18 months earlier, presumed by some to have simply left the country, by others, including eventually Ethan himself, in his darker private moments, to have possibly not survived that night at all. Nobody, that is, except a lawyer named Daniel Brooks, who Walter brought in during month 14 to handle the increasingly complex web of contracts and acquisitions, and who, reviewing the company's ownership documents late one night, paused on a name buried 3 shell companies deep and felt something click into place that would change everything that came next. "Walter," Daniel said carefully, the next morning, sliding a printout across the desk, "does Nia know you've been quietly acquiring debt positions in Sterling Holdings for the past 4 months?" Walter's face didn't change. "She will. When the time's right, and when's that?" Walter looked out the window, toward a skyline that held somewhere in it a mansion with a front door Nia hadn't stopped seeing in her dreams. "When Sterling Holdings needs saving," Walter said quietly, "and there's only one company left in America capable of saving it." Daniel set down his coffee slowly. "You've been planning this for months." "I've been planning this," Walter corrected, "since the night I found her on that sidewalk and recognized the look on her face. I've seen that look before, Daniel. On my own daughter's face, a long time ago, right before I lost her for good because I chose the wrong things at the wrong time." His jaw tightened. "I'm not making that mistake twice. Not with this one." Outside, 18 months of quiet, sleepless, Relentless work was about to collide with an empire that had no idea it was already standing on borrowed time, and a woman it had thrown into the rain was about to walk back through its doors as the only thing standing between it and total collapse. "Sit down, Mr. Sterling." The voice belonged to Daniel Brooks, calm as still water, though the words landed in that boardroom like a verdict already decided. "This will go faster if everyone remains seated." Nobody sat. Nia hadn't spoken yet. Noah had stopped humming and was watching his father's face with the frank, unbothered curiosity only a child can afford in a room full of grown people quietly falling apart. "We'll return to that room. But first, the 14 months that made it inevitable. Sterling Holdings began dying the way most empires do. Quietly, from the inside, long before anyone outside the family noticed the cracks. Richard Sterling had spent 30 years building relationships with banks, suppliers, and regulators on a foundation of trust that Samuel Carter had helped him maintain, trust earned through decades of honest dealing, of never overpromising, of treating every partner as though the relationship mattered more than any single deal. Richard had understood something Ethan never bothered to learn. An empire isn't built on capital. It's built on people believing you'll still be trustworthy tomorrow. Ethan inherited the capital. He never inherited the trust. Within a year of his father's death, Ethan had renegotiated 3 major supplier contracts to squeeze out short-term margin, alienating partners who'd worked with Sterling for 20 years. He'd fired Marcus Webb, the company's longtime operations director, a man who'd once caught a catastrophic shipping error that would have cost the company 9 figures, because Marcus had, in a board meeting, gently suggested that Ethan's aggressive expansion plan was moving faster than our infrastructure can support. "My father built this company on caution," Ethan told the board that day, months after the funeral, his voice carrying the particular confidence of a man who has never once been forced to clean up his own mess. "I intend to build the next chapter on ambition." Margaret, seated at the head of the family section, had beamed with pride at those words. She would remember them very differently 14 months later. Olivia Sterling watched her brother's transformation with a growing unease she didn't voice for a long time. She'd been raised on the same diet of superiority her mother served at every meal. The quiet, constant lesson that Carters and Sterlings existed in different categories of human being, that kindness toward lesser people was a currency you spent only when it cost you nothing. She'd laughed once at a family dinner when Margaret made a cutting remark about Na's secretary-class manners. She still remembered the sting of shame that followed weeks later, watching Naya flinch and excuse herself early, and telling herself it didn't matter, that Naya would get used to it. Nia never got the chance to get used to it. Olivia understood that now, though understanding had come slowly and late, it started with small things. A photograph she found while clearing out her father's study 8 months after his death, Richard and Samuel Carter, decades younger, standing together at what looked like a company's founding ceremony, Richard's arms slung around Samuel's shoulders like brothers. On the back, in her father's handwriting, "The man who saved us all and never once asked for credit." Then it was a conversation with Rosa, the housekeeper, who mentioned, carefully, cautiously, testing whether it was safe to say at all, how kind Naya had always been to the staff, how she'd once spent her own small allowance buying a birthday cake for Rosa's daughter when nobody else in the family had remembered the date. "She was good to us," Rosa said quietly, not meeting Olivia's eyes. Nobody in this house was good to her back. Olivia had gone to her mother that evening, hesitant, testing the water. "Mom, do you ever think about how we treated Nia?" Margaret hadn't even looked up from her tablet. "I think about how a woman with no breeding and no dowry married into this family and then had the audacity to get pregnant and disappear rather than fight for her marriage like a woman with any self-respect." "She didn't disappear, Mum." Ethan closed the door on her. In the rain, Ethan did what was necessary. Margaret's voice had gone sharp and final, the same tone she'd used 100 times to end conversations she found inconvenient. "That family owed us nothing more than what your father already gave them, a job, a house, decades of a paycheck. If Samuel Carter's daughter couldn't hold together a marriage handed to her on a silver platter, that's a reflection of her, not of us." Olivia had said nothing more that night, but something had shifted quietly, permanently, and it would keep shifting for the next 10 months, until the woman she'd once dismissed walked back through their lives holding a level of power none of them had prepared for. By month 16, the cracks in Sterling Holdings had become visible to anyone paying attention. Ethan's expansion into overseas manufacturing, the ambitious next chapter he'd promised the board, had been built on debt financed against the company's core logistics division, the same division Richard had spent 30 years insulating from risk. when a major shipping partner in Southeast Asia collapsed amid a regulatory scandal, taking two of Sterling's key contracts down with it, the company's exposure became suddenly brutally visible. Banks that had extended Richard Sterling credit on a handshake for 3 decades looked at Ethan's balance sheet and saw a stranger. 3 separate loan applications were rejected within 6 weeks. A credit rating agency downgraded Sterling Holdings from investment grade to junk status, and shareholders, the same shareholders who'd applauded Ethan's ambition 14 months earlier, began selling in a panic that fed on itself. "We need capital, Ethan." Daniel Brooks would later learn this conversation took place in the same study where Richard had once told Nia about promises. This time it was the board's CFO speaking, a man named Preston Yale, his voice tight with barely controlled alarm. "Not in 6 months now. Within weeks, or we default on the Q3 obligations and the banks start seizing collateral." "Find someone," Ethan said, and for the first time in 14 months, something like fear had crept into his voice. "There has to be someone willing to invest. There's exactly one company in the country with the balance sheet and the supply chain expertise to absorb our position without gutting us for parts." Preston hesitated. "It's a private firm. Nobody's ever seen the founder in person. They call her the Ghost CEO." Ethan finished quietly. He'd read the headlines, of course. Everyone in his industry had, watching in bewildered admiration as a faceless company reshaped an entire sector in 18 months. He had no reason on earth to connect that name to anything in his own life. Reach out, whatever it takes. Margaret found out about the meeting from Olivia 3 days before it was scheduled, and her reaction surprised her daughter more than she expected. "Absolutely not," Margaret snapped, pacing the length of the study. "We do not go begging to some anonymous startup founder like a company that can't manage its own affairs." "Mom, we don't have a choice," Ethan says. "Ethan has run this family's legacy into the ground in 14 months, Margaret said, and there was something raw underneath the fury now, something that sounded, for the first time in Olivia's memory, almost like genuine fear. "Your father spent 30 years building something that survived recessions, lawsuits, 2 hostile takeover attempts. And your brother is going to lose it to a stranger because he couldn't be bothered to learn anything from the man whose name is on the building." "Then help him," Olivia said quietly, "instead of just being angry about it." Margaret didn't answer. She turned instead to the window, looking out at the driveway where 18 months and 3 days earlier, a young pregnant woman had once knelt in the rain begging for a mercy nobody in this house had been willing to give her. Something in Margaret's expression, for one unguarded second, looked almost like recognition, like a memory surfacing that she'd spent 1.5 years working very hard to bury. She said nothing about it. But that night, for the first time since the funeral, Margaret Sterling didn't sleep. The meeting was set for a Tuesday morning in a boardroom on the 41st floor of a glass tower neither Ethan nor Margaret had ever visited, belonging to a holding company whose ownership structure, Daniel Brooks, had spent 4 months quietly, legally, meticulously assembling into an ironclad position, one that gave his client not just leverage, but outright control if she chose to use it. "You don't have to do this," Walter told Nia the night before, watching her lay out a black suit with the careful precision of someone preparing for battle rather than a business meeting. Noah slept in the next room, one small fist curled against his cheek. "We could structure the deal through intermediaries. You never have to see any of them again if you don't want to." Nia was quiet for a long moment, looking at the small ring still on her left hand, a ring she'd never taken off, not once in 18 months, though she couldn't have fully explained to anyone, even herself, exactly why. "I want to see his face, Walter," she said finally. "Not because I need revenge. I need to know if I'm still the same person who used to shrink in rooms like that one. I need to see for myself that I'm not her anymore." Walter studied her for a long moment, something protective and proud moving behind his eyes. "And if you walk in there and some part of you still shrinks, then I'll know exactly how far I still have to go." She met his eyes steadily. "Either way, I need the truth. I've spent enough of my life not having it." What neither of them knew, what wouldn't surface until the following week, when Daniel finally opened a certain sealed letter that had been sitting in a locked drawer in Richard Sterling's old study for exactly 18 months, per his final written instructions, was that the truth waiting for Nia inside that boardroom was only the first of 2 reckonings. The second one would come from a dead man who had known, somehow from the very beginning, precisely how this story was always going to end. The boardroom doors had been open for 11 seconds, and no one had said a word. Nia crossed the threshold first, Noah's small hand wrapped around 2 of her fingers, her heels the only sound in a room that suddenly felt much smaller than 41 floors up. She didn't look at Ethan yet. She looked first at the space itself, the glass, the skyline, the 19 faces frozen mid-motion like a photograph nobody had asked to be taken. Then she looked at him. Ethan Sterling had aged in 18 months in a way that had nothing to do with time. There were lines at his eyes that hadn't been there before, a greyness under the practiced polish of his suit. He looked, Nia thought, with something that surprised her by not being satisfaction, like a man who had finally understood the size of what he'd lost, and had understood it too late to do anything but stand there and watch the bill come due. Nia. Her name came out of him broken in the middle, like a word he hadn't practiced saying out loud in a long time. Margaret's hand found the back of a chair. She did not sit. Her face had gone the color of old paper. Olivia was the only one who moved. A small step forward, involuntary, her eyes going straight to Noah and staying there, filling with something that looked unmistakably like grief for time she couldn't get back. Daniel Brooks closed the door quietly behind them and took his position at Nia's side. "Shall we begin?" Preston Yale, the CFO, was the first to find his voice, and he tried visibly, admirably, to keep this a business meeting. Miss. He hesitated, realizing he didn't actually know what name to use. "Carter," Nia said evenly. "Nia Carter. You can address the paperwork to my company. Hayes Carter Logistics Solutions, Carter." Preston recovered his footing. "We understand your firm is prepared to discuss a capital infusion into Sterling Holdings. We're grateful you agreed to meet in person, given the unconventional profile your company has maintained publicly." "I don't do many meetings in person," Nia said. "I made an exception for this one." She let that sentence sit in the room a moment longer than necessary, and watched Ethan's jaw tighten as understanding began to surface behind his eyes. Not full understanding yet, but the first cold edge of it, the sense that something in this room was not what it appeared to be. Daniel opened his leather folder and slid a document across the table. "The terms are straightforward. Hayes Carter is prepared to acquire a controlling interest in Sterling Holdings, 61%, structured through the acquisition of distressed debt currently held against your logistics and manufacturing divisions. This resolves your Q3 obligations, prevents bank seizure of collateral, and stabilizes the company going forward. Controlling interest." Preston's voice had gone thin. That would mean the Sterling family retains a minority position in the company your father built." "Yes," Daniel said simply. Margaret finally spoke, and her voice, for the first time in this story, had lost its edge entirely. "This is extortion, no," Nia said, and it was the first time she'd addressed Margaret directly. Her voice was calm, not cold, not performing calm, but genuinely, unshakably calm. The calm of someone who had spent 18 months learning exactly how much weight her own voice could carry without needing to raise it. "This is the only offer on the table that doesn't end with 3,000 employees losing their jobs when the banks liquidate this company for parts. You're welcome to reject it and find another buyer. I'm told you have until Friday." Nobody in the room doubted there was no other buyer. Margaret's mouth opened, then closed. Something in her posture, for the first time Nia had ever witnessed, actually deflated. Ethan stood slowly, and Preston reached out as if to stop him, then thought better of it. "Can we speak?" Ethan said quietly, "just for a moment, not about the deal." Daniel glanced at Nia. She nodded once. The rest of the room didn't leave. This wasn't a scene that afforded that kind of privacy anymore, not after everything, but they went quiet, and Ethan walked around the table until he stood a few feet from her, close enough now that his eyes could no longer avoid the boy at her side, and Noah looked up at him with open, curious, entirely unafraid eyes that had never once been taught to fear this man, because he had never had the chance to teach him anything at all. Ethan's knees found the floor before he seemed to decide to let them. The sound of a Sterling kneeling in that boardroom was, in its own way, as loud as the sound of a door closing 18 months earlier. "I was blind," Ethan said, and his voice broke fully this time, no performance left in it, nothing left to protect. "I let my mother's voice become my own before I ever thought to ask if it was true. I told myself you were a debt my father owed, instead of a person I was lucky enough to marry. I watched you kneel in the rain and I closed a door instead of opening my arms, and I have spent 18 months understanding exactly what that cost me every single day, and it has not once gotten easier to live with." He looked up at her and at his son, and something in his face was breaking apart in real time. "Please give me another chance, not for the company, for him, for whatever's left that might still be possible between us." The room held its breath. Nia looked down at him for a long moment. She thought about the girl who had knelt on marble steps in the rain, begging for mercy she hadn't received. She thought about Walter's hands, steady and patient, teaching her to read a balance sheet at 2 in the morning while Noah slept in a borrowed crib. She thought about every night she had chosen, exhausted and afraid, to get back up anyway. When I begged for mercy, she said quietly, you laughed. You called me a charity case in front of a room full of people who were supposed to be your friends. You watched me fall to my knees in the rain, pregnant with your son, and you turned around and closed the door yourself. She paused. Today you're the one on your knees. And I'm not laughing, Ethan. I want you to understand why. It's not because I've grown kinder than you were to me. It's because I refuse to become the kind of person you were. That refusal is mine. It has nothing left to do with you. She reached down, not unkindly, and signed the document Daniel had slid to her. Not to save Ethan's company, but to own it. Then she said the thing that would matter more to Ethan than anything else in that room, more than the papers, more than the money. You can be part of Noah's life, Ethan. Not because you've earned it back yet, you haven't, not close to it, but because he deserves a chance to know you, and because punishing him for your mistakes would make me exactly the person I just told you I refuse to become. That starts slowly. It starts with supervised time, real accountability, and years of you proving something with actions instead of tears in a boardroom. Tears aren't an ending, they're barely a beginning. Ethan nodded, unable to speak, and for the first time something like genuine hope, earned, fragile, unguaranteed, crossed his face instead of desperation. Margaret hadn't moved from beside the chair. When Naya finally looked at her, the older woman's eyes were wet, and her voice, when it came, had none of its old command left in it. I don't expect forgiveness, Margaret said. I don't think I've earned the right to ask for it. No, Nia agreed, you haven't. She let the silence hold a moment and then unexpectedly softened it. But Olivia has started to try. I've watched from a distance. That matters more than you might think. Whether you're capable of the same thing, that's between you and however much time you have left to prove it. Not to me. To yourself. Margaret said nothing more. It was, perhaps, the most honest silence she had offered in her entire life. There was one more piece of this story, and it arrived that same evening in the form of a phone call from an estate attorney Nia had never met. A man named Foster, who had been holding a sealed letter in a firm's vault for exactly 18 months, per the final written instructions of Richard Sterling. Nia opened it alone that night in the quiet of her apartment, Noah asleep down the hall, Walter waiting patiently in the next room in case she needed him. Nia, if you're reading this, 18 months have passed, and I suspect a great deal has happened that I could not have controlled from wherever I've gone. I want you to know something before you decide what to do with whatever power you've built by now, because I always believed you would build something. I saw it in you before Ethan ever gave you the chance to. The promise I made your father wasn't about a marriage. Samuel never asked me for anything in 31 years, not once, though God knows I offered. The debt I owed him was too large to repay with money, so I tried, foolishly, to repay it with a family. I see now that was a mistake. I asked you to save my son from a coldness I helped create in him, and that wasn't fair to you, but I made a second arrangement you don't know about. Years ago, an old friend of mine, a man who'd once built and lost an empire of his own, told me he was living quietly, anonymously, doing good where he could without anyone knowing his name. I asked him if the day ever came when my family failed you the way I feared they might, to find you, to help you, not to fix things for you, Nia. I didn't believe in that, and neither did he, but to make sure you were never as alone as I feared you might become in that house. His name is Walter Hayes. I suspect by now you already know him well. I am not asking you to forgive my son or my wife or this family. I am asking only this. Whatever you build with what's left of your life, build it because it is true to you, not because it answers what was done to you. Revenge feels like justice for exactly as long as it takes to get it. What lasts longer, Nia, is the person you choose to become on the other side of it. I believed in you before you had any reason to believe in yourself. I hope, 18 months from now, you've finally caught up to what I already knew. With more respect than I ever managed to say aloud, Richard. Nia sat with the letter for a long time, tears falling silently, understanding finally settling into place, that Walter finding her on that sidewalk hadn't been chance at all, that Richard Sterling had reached across his own death to make sure she was never truly alone, that even in the coldest house she had ever lived in, one person had seen her clearly the entire time. She found Walter in the next room, and without a word handed him the letter. He read it slowly, and when he finished his eyes were wet too, for reasons that belonged to his own long grief, to a daughter he'd lost, to a promise from an old friend he had quietly, faithfully kept. He knew, Walter said softly. All along he knew exactly who you'd become. No, Nia said. I don't think he knew. I think he hoped. There's a difference, Walter. I've learned that too this year. She looked toward the window, toward a skyline that held somewhere in it a mansion that would soon legally belong to her, and a front door she intended to walk through one final time, not for revenge, but to close a chapter with her own two hands instead of leaving it closed by someone else's. She went the following week, alone, Noah left in Victoria's careful hands for the afternoon. The mansion was quieter than she remembered. The staff mostly gone now, the grandeur of it dulled by 14 months of financial strain Ethan hadn't managed to hide from the walls themselves. She walked up the same marble steps where she had once knelt in the rain, and she stood in front of the same door. She placed her hand flat against the wood, feeling the grain of it beneath her palm, and she thought about every version of herself that door had witnessed, the hopeful bride, the humiliated wife, the broken woman on her knees, and now this one, steady, whole, asking nothing of the wood or the house or the family beyond it except the truth of her own survival. 18 months ago, she said quietly, to no one, to everyone, to the girl she used to be, I left this house with nothing. She paused, feeling the weight of the moment settle, gentle rather than triumphant. Today I return with everything you said I would never become, but I'm not staying. This house was never what I wanted. I just needed to know I could walk through this door on my own terms one time before I let it go for good. She turned, and Noah's small shoes waited for her at the bottom of the steps where Victoria had brought him to meet her, unable to resist bringing him along after all. She took her son's hand and she walked away, not fast, not triumphant, just steady, the way a person walks when they are finally completely, no longer running from anything at all. Behind her, through a window, Margaret Sterling watched her go, and for the first time in her life, said nothing, because there was, at last, nothing left to say that would matter. Somewhere behind the walls of a home he no longer fully owned, Ethan Sterling watched too and did not try to stop her, not because he didn't want to, but because he had finally, painfully, learned the one lesson his father had spent a lifetime trying to teach him. Some doors, once closed, are not yours to open again. All you can do is spend the rest of your life becoming someone worth trusting with a different one. End.